It's so nice to have a chance to talk to you guys again. Thank you for tuning in. So I'm here at the farm for one last week. I brought a friend to see you. We'll talk about him in a second. And you may see my dog, Wooten. This is my dog, Wooten. He's going to make some cameo appearances probably because he really wants to get close to the chicken here. I hope you guys are all doing well. And I'm looking forward to a time when we can see each other again. But I really appreciate that you tune in and listen. And I get a chance to share with you from God's Word, even though I can't see you in person. And for those of you who are joined in on some of the digital small groups this week, oh, it was so great to get to see you and have a chance to talk face-to-face on Zoom. I look forward to seeing you guys again next week. So this week, I brought my friend to help introduce our lesson today. This is my rooster. I have one rooster. His name is And Dumplings. Actually, that's his nickname. His name is Andy Dumplings, but I just call him And Dumplings for short. And I brought him because, I don't know if you've been around chickens and roosters much, but roosters, well, chickens in general are mean, but roosters are really mean. And this guy spends a lot of his time just going around and pecking the other hens, because they're in his way. They're not where he wants them to be, or he's trying to get to the feed and they're in the way and he'll peck them, or he just walks up and pecks them. He is a mean rooster, and most roosters are like that. And the reason that I brought him today is because sometimes that's how people think God is. Some people think that God is he's just mean. He's just looking for us to make a mistake so he can get us, or he can punish us. And our job then is to make sure we follow all the rules and do all the things he wants us to do. And if we do that, then God will treat us well. But if we don't, he'll punish us. And it ends up being one of the ways that people misunderstand what God is like and try to control God. Because when you think of God this way, you can control him by doing the right thing. If you do the right thing, then God has to bless you. And if you do the wrong thing, then God has to punish you. But guys, God is much more than that. God is much more than that. God doesn't just want to punish us. He's just not watching for a chance to peck us or to punish us. God loves us and wants to be with us. And even when he makes rules for us to follow, it's so that we can live at peace with him and enjoy being close to him. So Miss Jessica is going to do a Bible story and read one of my favorite stories for you guys for this subject, and I hope that all of that will help you understand that God's desire is not to punish us, but God's desire is to be with us. Okay? All right. Thank you guys for tuning in. Say goodbye, and dumplings. Bye. All right. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.
Hi, boys and girls. We're talking about how God desires that we live our life with him. Last week, Mr. Mike talked about how God doesn't want us to be in charge and try to live our lives apart from him, like Adam and Eve did in last week's Bible lesson. Instead, he wants us to let him be in charge and be in relationship with him without fear. Today, we're going to talk about another way people, Christians, might view or treat God that is not the way that God has intended. And this view of God is how pagan religions have viewed their little g gods. And that is that we need to do things to appease God, to keep him happy, or we fear his punishment. Like he's watching our every move and is ready to strike us down when we mess up. In today's Bible lesson, Jesus is literally on earth with people, and both the religious leaders, the Pharisees, and Jesus' closest friends, the disciples, treat God as one you don't want to cross. As we read through the story from John 9 about Jesus healing a man who was born blind, look for the different ways the disciples and the Pharisees treat or view God. As Jesus was walking through Jerusalem, he saw a man who had been born blind. His disciples asked, "Teacher, is this man blind because he did wrong, or was it that his parents did wrong?" "His blindness is not because of his sin or his parents' sin," Jesus replied. "I am here to do what God wants," Jesus continued. I am the light of the world." Then Jesus spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," Jesus told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." The man felt his way through the narrow streets to the pool. When he washed the mud from his eyes, he could see for the first time in his life. His neighbors and friends asked, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Doubters said, "No, he only looks like him." "It's me," the man exclaimed, and explained what had happened. "Where is the person who helped you?" they asked. The man did not know. They took the man to some Pharisees who asked what had happened. "He put mud in my eyes," the man replied. "I washed it off, and now I can see." When the Pharisees realized the miracle had taken place on the Sabbath, some thought this miracle could not be from God, but others insisted it had to be. They sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son, the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "He is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind, but we don't know how he can now see. Why don't you ask him?" The Pharisees summoned the man again. "Tell the truth," they ordered. "We know the man who did this has to be a sinner." "I don't know whether he is a sinner," he replied, "but I do know I was blind, but now I can see." "How did he open your eyes?" they demanded. I've already told you," the man told them. "Do you want to become his disciples too?" The Pharisees hurled insults at him. The man protested, "If the man who did this was not from God, he could not have healed me." "How dare you lecture us?" the proud Pharisees retorted. "You were full of sin from birth." Then they threw him out. When Jesus heard the man had been thrown out, he went looking for him. "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Jesus asked. "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so I may believe in him." "You can see him now," Jesus replied. "In fact, he is the one speaking with you." "Lord, I believe," the man said, and worshiped Jesus. Boys and girls, in our Bible lesson today, both the disciples and the Pharisees in this passage have a wrong attitude towards God. Both of them think of God like a school principal. Now, I don't want to knock you parents who may be a school principal or a school administrator, but we all know the stereotype or the view of a school principal, that they're one to be feared, or if you get sent to the principal's office, it's not a good thing because you're probably in trouble. But they are viewing him like a principal, or one who watches over people, judges their behavior, and then punishes them when they do wrong. This attitude towards God is why the disciples thought that the man's blindness must be the result of someone's sin. People who have this attitude toward God are trying to still be in control. It's the idea that as long as I follow the rules, God will then bless me. I control God by following the rules. This attitude towards God is why the Pharisees were angry with Jesus. He healed on the Sabbath, which the Pharisees believed was against the rules. But notice something. Jesus was right there. He had come to earth to physically be with them in person. Jesus showed them his power and his care for people by healing the blind man. But Jesus wasn't following their rules. They wanted to be in charge instead of letting God be in charge. This is kind of a heavy idea for some of you, and so we have a book to share that hopefully will illustrate this a little better. The book I'm going to read today is called Sydney and Norman, A Tale of Two Pigs, and it's written by Phil Vischer. On a quiet street in a quiet town lived two pigs. They didn't oink or eat slop. No, this isn't that kind of story. They wore suit coats and went to work. And even though they lived right next door to each other, they didn't know each other's names. The pig on the right was Norman. He was a very good pig. Rules and hard work had always come easily to him, and it showed. His house was neat and organized. He always looked his very best. He gave money to the needy and never missed church on Sunday. Norman's teachers liked him when he was young, and his boss at work liked him now that he was all grown up. He was pretty sure God liked him too. After all, he was a very good pig. Norman figured that everyone could be as good as he was if they just try a little harder. He wondered why they didn't. The pig on the left was Sydney. Things didn't come easily for Sydney. Rules and systems and schedules seemed, well, a bit slippery. One minute he thought he had them, and the next minute, whoops, where'd they go? He was forever running 10 minutes late and could never manage, no matter how hard he tried, to get his tie perfectly straight. Not like his neighbor. What was his name? Sydney got in trouble in school, which frustrated his teachers. He got in trouble at work, which frustrated his boss. He knew God was watching and figured he was pretty frustrated too. But most of all, Sydney frustrated Sydney. Why was everything so hard? Why couldn't he be more like, oh, what was his name? Sydney felt broken, and some days that made it hard to get up in the morning. Some days, in fact, Sydney couldn't get up at all. Since Sydney was usually late and Norman was usually early, they seldom saw each other, unless, that is, they happened to fetch their mail at the same time, which is exactly what happened one bright morning in October. Now, normally if Sydney saw Norman, he would look down and shuffle back inside. He was sure Norman was staring at his tie or his hair or the papers half stuck in his briefcase. He was sure Norman was looking down on him for being messy, which for the most part was absolutely correct. But this day, Norman didn't look at Sydney's tie, and Sydney didn't look away because they were both staring at the small pale blue envelopes they had received in the mail. One was addressed to Norman and the other to Sydney. Had someone invited them both to the same party? Eager to unravel the mystery, the two pigs opened the envelopes. Norman read, "Dear Norman," and Sydney read, "Dear Sydney," followed by, "I would like you to come visit me at 77 Elm Street next Tuesday at your convenience. I have something to tell you." They both glanced at the bottom of the page and read, "Sincerely, God." Sydney and Norman reread the invitation several times to make sure they had read them correctly. God wanted to talk to them? On Tuesday? On Elm Street? Sydney panicked. Deep in his heart was a familiar feeling, the feeling he had felt when, as a young pig, his teacher had sent him to the principal's office. Terror, panic, doom. Norman smiled. He too felt a familiar feeling, the feeling he had felt when, as a young pig, he was called up in front of the school to receive an award. Anticipation, happiness, pride. Sydney taped the invitation to the inside of his front door so he wouldn't lose it. Norman entered the date neatly in his date book. Both pigs had trouble sleeping that night for very different reasons. Tuesday came. Norman awoke early, dressed, and headed down the street with the pale blue envelope firmly in hand. Just waking up, Sydney saw him pass by the window and rushed for the shower. Norman walked tall and proud. Others on the street noticed he looked a bit taller and more than a little puffier than usual that morning. His hair was neat and his tie extraordinarily straight, much straighter than anyone else's on the street. God would certainly be pleased. Norman found the address and went inside, greeting the woman at the front desk with his important voice. She directed him down a long hall, through a heavy wooden door, into a large room, where he found God sitting behind an immense desk. The sight made Norman nervous, but then he thought, what did he have to be nervous about? He was a good pig. God walked around the desk and smiled at the puffed-up pig. "I'm glad you could make it," he said warmly. "I have a few things to tell you." "First of all," God began, "I love you." Norman smiled, though he wasn't surprised. "Secondly, your goodness is not the reason I love you." Norman startled a little. What a curious thing for God to say. "Thirdly," God continued, "you're not as good as you have led yourself to believe. You're prideful, you're selfish, you look down on others simply because things don't come as easily for them." God looked a little sad now. "I love them just as much as I love you. Don't look down on those I love." Then God smiled and returned to his desk. "That is what I needed to tell you." Norman swallowed hard. That was the award? That was the commendation? Confused, he turned and ran down the hall, past the front desk, and back out onto the street. His head was spinning. He felt dizzy. Was God finding fault with him? He was a good pig. He noticed his tie was off kilter and hurried to straighten it. Not perfect, but at least better than that fellow over there in the yellow jacket, or the guy in the blue, or any of these people for that matter. Then it hit him. He was looking down on those people right then, right there, just like God had said. And he'd done it yesterday and the day before, 20 times a day at least. Norman's face grew hot. God was right. He was selfish. He was prideful. For the first time in his life, the good pig had to face the fact that he had been very, very bad. His pride and his goodness was his sin. He buried his face in his hands and hurried home, tears splashing on his neat gray suit. From his window, Sidney saw his neighbor return and froze in shock. Was he crying? Sidney couldn't breathe. Oh dear, oh dear. If that's what a visit with God did to that guy, he was doomed. Hands shaking, Sidney tried one more time to get his tie to lie just right. Why was it so hard? Now, where was his hat? Not on the hook, of course. Oh, under the couch. Hat in hand, he peeled the pale blue envelope off the door and stepped outside. A bird was singing that morning, but Sidney didn't hear it. The sun was shining brightly, but Sidney didn't see it. Doomed, he thought, doomed. Sidney trudged down the sidewalk and suddenly back in school. A little pig headed down the long hall toward the principal's office, hands sweating, heart racing, doomed. He'll see right through me, Sidney thought as he turned onto Elm Street. My messes, my mistakes, everything. And then he was there. Though he had walked as slowly as he could, he was there. Sidney stepped inside. He tried to say something to the woman at the front desk, but found he couldn't speak. He smiled and motioned him to a heavy wooden door down the hall. He gulped. A few moments later, he stood before the door. He wanted to run away. He wanted to hide, but there was no place to go and nothing to hide behind. So hat in hand, he pushed open the door and slipped inside. And there, behind the desk, was God. Sidney gulped again. I'm glad you could come, God said, smiling. Sidney tried to respond, but couldn't make a noise. I wanted to tell you something, God continued as he came around the desk. Sidney glanced around nervously. Maybe if he apologized. First of all, God began, I love you. Sidney startled, surprised. Secondly, God continued in a quieter voice, I love you. Sidney was gripping his hat a little less tightly now. And thirdly, God paused, very close to Sidney. I love you. The look in God's eyes warmed Sidney right down to his toes. That is what I wanted to tell you, God said, as he stepped back toward his desk, still smiling. Sidney froze for a moment. Then, realizing God had finished, he turned and ran quickly from the room. I don't understand, he said aloud when he reached the street. Didn't he see me? Didn't he see who I am? It didn't make sense. Then it occurred to Sidney, I did it. I fooled him. Sidney looked at the others on the street, smiling. Yes, that must be it. I looked good when it was most important, and he bought it. Just then, Sidney caught his reflection in a store window. His hair was rumpled, his tie off kilter as usual, sported a large toothpaste stain. His smile vanished. That couldn't be it. He couldn't have fooled anybody, not looking like that. Sidney was confused. There was only one other possibility, that God just loved him. Exactly like he was, messes and all. Sidney felt the warmth he had seen in God's eyes welling up inside him again. Others on the street would later talk about the small, messy pig they saw that day that appeared to be, well, glowing. All the way home, Sidney looked for words to tell everyone what he was feeling, but all he found were tears, happy tears, lots of them. The next day, two pigs emerged from their homes on a bright, crisp October morning and looked at each other. The pig on the left, named Sidney, who seemed a bit taller than before, looked at his neighbor's neat, straight tie and clean clothes and smiled. The pig on the right, named Norman, who seemed ever so slightly less puffy, looked at his neighbor's crooked tie and rumpled hair and smiled. It was a real smile, too. The kind that comes from deep inside, the kind he hadn't smiled in a long, long time. Sidney and Norman became good friends. There were still mornings now and then when Norman would wake up feeling a little puffy, but all he had to do was remember what he had learned at 77 Elm Street. Then the puffiness would quickly vanish and his real smile would return. And as for Sidney, he still had his share of messes, though not as many as before. And there were still a few days when he wasn't quite sure he could get up in the morning. But if you stood outside his window on one of those days, this is what you'd hear. First of all, he loves me. Secondly, he loves me. And thirdly, he loves me. And that was all it took. All right, Norman the good pig thought that since he hadn't followed the rules, I'm sorry, I asked it over. I said that wrong. Take two. Norman the good pig thought that since he had followed the rules, God must owe him that he would get an award. And Sidney in the story, the messy pig, he thought that because he had failed to follow the rules, that God must not want to be with him. And remember, he said he was doomed. Now, both pigs believed that you could either earn God's favor or lose his favor by either following or not following the rules. Both of them in this process were missing out on what really knowing God was like and being with God. Once they understood at the end of the story that God loved them, then things totally changed. We talk about God's unconditional love all the time in Treehouse when we have our time of tithes and offerings. And we talk about there's nothing that we can do or that we won't do that will keep us from God's love, because that's not how God works. Okay, we say this all the time, so I want you to say it with me. He just loves us. Let's say that again. He just loves us. And we're learning that he wants us to live life with him. Not us trying to be in charge, not trying to earn his satisfaction or run from his punishment, but he desires that we love him and want to be with him too. I hope you guys have a great week and hope to see you soon. Bye.